The morning Myrtle Whitfield walked into the Dalton Creek Land office with a bruise the color of a stormy sky stretched from her left cheekbone down to her jaw. Every man in that stuffy room found something extraordinarily interesting to study in the floorboards beneath his boots. The land office smelled of sawdust and ink, and the particular kind of cowardice that settles into a room like smoke when nobody wants to be the first to speak an uncomfortable truth. There were 3 men ahead of her in the line: a stout rancher named Beaumont who was filing a grazing extension, a young surveyor's assistant clutching a rolled map to his chest like it was a holy scripture, and Deputy Sheriff Arlen Hobbs, who had ridden in to register a deed transfer on behalf of the county. Not one of them turned to look at her directly. Not one of them offered a word of greeting or concern. The clerk behind the counter, a narrow-shouldered man named Felix Potts who wore his spectacles halfway down his nose, glanced up when she approached, took in the full tableau of her face, and then proceeded to sort through a stack of papers with the focused dedication of a man who had decided, in that precise moment, that paperwork was the single most important thing happening on Earth. It was the year 1882, and in Dalton Creek, Texas, a woman's bruise was her own private business, and everyone was very committed to keeping it that way. Myrtle set her leather satchel on the counter with a quiet, deliberate thud. She had ridden 11 miles to get here, dressed in her good calico dress with the blue flowers, because she believed that if you were going to fight for something, you ought to look like you meant it. Her dark hair was pinned neatly under her hat. Her chin was lifted at an angle that suggested she had decided, some miles back on that dusty road, that she was not going to cry today. She had cried enough. Today she was going to file a homestead claim on the 160 acres that had been in her family since her father broke his back clearing it. And nobody, not the bruise, not the stares, not the silence, was going to stop her. "I need to file a homestead claim," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt it had any right to. Felix Potts cleared his throat. "Ma'am, you need your husband's signature on A. I am not married," Myrtle said, cutting him off with a politeness so clean it might have drawn blood. "My father, Horace Whitfield, passed 6 weeks ago. The land falls to me as his sole surviving kin. I have the original land patent here, the death certificate issued by Dr. Aldous Greer of this county, and a letter from Reverend Marsh attesting to my identity and relationship to the deceased." She opened the satchel and laid each document on the counter as she named it, smoothing them flat with the same deliberate calm she might use arranging Sunday dishes. Felix Potts looked at the documents. He looked at her face. He looked back at the documents. It's a complicated process, ma'am, for an unmarried woman to hold title. You might want to come back with someone who could assist you with the legal. The Homestead Act of 1862, Myrtle said, permits any head of household to file, and an unmarried woman over the age of 21 qualifies as head of household. I am 26 years old. I have everything you require. I would like to file today. The silence in that room was the loudest thing Myrtle had ever heard. Beaumont, the rancher, shifted his weight. The surveyor's assistant developed a sudden intense interest in the wall-mounted map of the county. Deputy Arlen Hobbs rocked on his heels and stared at a point somewhere above Myrtle's head, as though he could see something magnificent on the ceiling that no one else could perceive. Felix Potts took the documents. He reviewed them with the theatrical slowness of a man hoping that if he moved cautiously enough, someone else would solve the problem for him. Nobody did. "I'll need to register this with the county assessor," he finally said. "It won't be official today." "That is perfectly fine," Myrtle said, "as long as you take my filing and give me a receipt." He gave her the receipt. His handwriting was cramped and he blotted the ink twice, but he gave it to her, and Myrtle folded it and placed it in the inner pocket of her satchel with the reverence of someone filing away a battle flag. She turned from the counter, walked the length of that silent room, and pushed through the heavy wooden door into the bright, punishing Texas sunlight. She stood on the wooden boardwalk for a moment, just breathing, letting the warmth hit her face and not minding when it found the bruise and made it ache, because aching meant she was still here, still standing, still fighting. She was so focused on breathing through that first wave of relief that she did not immediately notice the man leaning against the hitching post directly in front of her. He was tall, genuinely, unavoidably tall, the kind of tall that made the world seem like it had been scaled for him specifically. He wore a brown canvas duster that had seen considerable weather, and a hat pushed back on his head at an angle that was less cocky than it was simply honest, as though it had drifted there through a long life of hard riding and just never been corrected. He had a jaw dark with a few days of growth, eyes the color of creek water on an overcast day, and an expression on his face that was not pity. Myrtle recognized pity, had been soaking in it for 6 weeks, and this was not it. What was on his face was something closer to controlled fury, directed with extraordinary precision at the door she had just walked out of. He had been waiting. She could tell by the way he was standing, not casually, not idly, but with the specific stillness of a man who had made a decision and was holding himself to it. When she appeared, he straightened, and the fury in his expression softened into something that was still intense but aimed differently now, aimed at her, but gently, the way you might aim a lantern at someone in the dark to help them see rather than to blind them. "They give you what you needed," he said. His voice was low and measured, a voice that didn't spend itself all at once. Myrtle looked at him. She had never seen this man before in her life. He was not from Dalton Creek. She knew most faces in Dalton Creek. "They did," she said carefully. "Good." He said it like a verdict. Then he said, "I've been standing out here for about 20 minutes waiting for one of those men inside to say something decent to you, and I want you to know that every single one of them should be ashamed of themselves." Myrtle stared at him. The plainness of it, the simple, uncomplicated directness of it, hit her somewhere in the chest in a way she had not expected. She had braced herself for so many things this morning. Sympathy, dismissal, legal obstruction. She had not braced herself for honesty. "You saw me go in," she said. "I was finishing up my own business with the assessor when you came through the door." He hesitated just briefly, and there was something in the hesitation that she would think about later, riding home, something that said he was choosing his next words carefully, not because he was unsure of them but because he wanted to get them right. "I don't know what's happened to you, ma'am. That's your business. But watching those men pretend not to see you, that made me angrier than I've been in a considerable while." "And yet you also waited outside," Myrtle said, and it came out slightly sharper than she meant it. Old habit. She softened it immediately. "Rather than coming in. You didn't look like a woman who needed rescuing," he said. "You looked like a woman who needed the road cleared and then left alone to walk it herself." He paused again. "But I wasn't going to ride off without saying something, even if the something was just that I saw it and I thought it was wrong." Myrtle regarded him for a long moment. Somewhere down the street, a wagon was rattling over the uneven road and 2 men were arguing about the price of grain, and a dog was sleeping in a strip of shade beside the feed store, and the world was carrying on with complete indifference to this moment, which made it feel, paradoxically, more significant. "Clyde Crawford," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. "I'm working a spread about 8 miles northeast of here, Rambling Fork Ranch." "Myrtle Whitfield," she said. "My land is 6 miles north of town." She hesitated, and then, because he had been honest with her, she offered a piece of honesty back, something she had not offered to anyone today. "I was afraid they wouldn't take the filing." "Were you afraid they'd see the bruise and assume you were some kind of that your situation was too complicated to bother with?" He asked with the directness of a man who does not believe in dancing around the actual thing. "Yes," she said. The word came out quietly. "Something like that." He nodded. It was not the nod of a man performing understanding. It was the nod of a man who actually understood. "Did they?" "They tried," she said. "I didn't let them." "I didn't think you would," he said. She almost smiled at that. It was not a full smile, she was not ready for that yet today, but it was the precursor of one, a small brightening around the eyes that she couldn't quite suppress. Clyde Crawford saw it, and something in his own expression answered it, the way a lamp in one window will catch the reflection of a lamp in the window across the street. They stood there for a moment in the sunlight, two strangers who had just exchanged more truth than either of them had planned to. And then Myrtle said, "I should be getting back. I have stock to tend. I'll let you go," he said. And then, because he was apparently a man who committed to things once he started them, he added, "If anything goes wrong with that filing, if they try to tie it up or throw some obstacle at you, there's a lawyer in Grover's Mill, name of Whitaker, who's handled land claims for women before. Worth knowing." "Thank you," she said, and she meant it with more weight than the two words usually carried. She unhitched her horse, a sturdy bay mare named Juniper, and swung up into the saddle with the ease of someone who had been riding since before she could properly see over a horse's back. She touched the brim of her hat at him, a gesture she'd inherited from her father, and turned Juniper down the main street toward the north road. She did not look back, but she thought about him the entire 11 miles home. The Whitfield homestead sat on a gentle rise above a creek that ran reliable water 9 months out of 12, surrounded by live oaks that her father had refused to cut down even when the neighbors told him he was losing grazing land to sentiment. Myrtle had always thought he was right. The oaks were the best thing about the property, and there were many good things: their shade long and cool in the afternoon, their roots holding the creek bank steady through the flash floods that came roaring down from the hills every few years. Her father, Horace Whitfield, had come to Texas from Tennessee in 1859, a broad-shouldered, stubborn man with a gift for reading weather and a deep, unglamorous dedication to the land that she had absorbed from him, the way she'd absorbed everything else slowly, through proximity, through watching how he stood at the edge of the field in the evening and looked at it the way other men looked at things they loved. He had never quite recovered from the death of her mother, Clara, 12 years ago. He had carried on because that was what he did, but some essential brightness had gone out of him after that, and Myrtle had spent the years since being both daughter and partner, learning the land alongside him and gradually, without anyone making a formal announcement about it, becoming the one who kept the books and negotiated the contracts and argued the accounts with the supply merchant in town. When he died quietly, in his sleep, in February of this year, 1882, she had not been surprised exactly. He had been failing since Christmas, going thin and gray in a way that reminded her of a fire burning down to the last good coals. But she had been gutted by it nonetheless, in the private and specific way that you are gutted when the person who has known you longest is suddenly gone, and the world becomes a place that holds no one who remembers you as a child. The bruise was 4 days old. It had come from a man named Silas Greer, not the doctor, a different Greer, no relation, who was the foreman of the neighboring Kingsley spread and who had, for the past 3 years, been working a patient and systematic campaign to acquire the Whitfield acreage. He had made offers. Her father had refused them. After Horace died, he had come back with new offers, aimed now at Myrtle, with an edge underneath them that had not been there before, an implication that a woman alone might find maintaining 160 acres to be more trouble than it was worth. She had refused him too. 4 days ago he had come again, this time with 2 of the Kingsley hands, and when she had told him again that the land was not for sale, he had grabbed her arm and told her she needed to think more carefully. She had pulled free and struck his hand away, and he had backhanded her across the face. Quickly, reflexively, the way a man does when he is not accustomed to refusal. It had shaken her more than she wanted to admit, not so much the pain as the sudden clarity of her vulnerability. She was 11 miles from town and alone on a piece of land that a powerful man wanted, and there was nobody on the planet whose job it was to care about that. She had decided, in the 20 minutes she spent sitting at her kitchen table afterward with a damp cloth pressed to her face, that the first thing she needed to do was get that land officially in her name. As long as the title was in flux, her father's name, the estate unsettled, There were ways a man with enough money and connections could complicate things. She needed her name on that land in the county record, plain and irrefutable, before Silas Greer figured out that she was trying to do exactly that. She had ridden to Dalton Creek the next morning. Now she was home, Juniper stabled and fed, the receipt from Felix Potts tucked safely in the tin box in the kitchen where her father had kept important documents, and Myrtle was standing in the doorway of the house looking out at the oaks in the long evening light and trying to decide how she felt. She felt unexpectedly like there might be one person in the world who had seen her today actually seen her, the whole situation, without flinching or looking away or trying to smooth it over with false comfort. And she did not know what to do with that feeling because she had become, in 6 weeks of solitary grief and struggle, somewhat unaccustomed to being seen. She thought about Clyde Crawford for longer than was strictly warranted, standing in that doorway. The way he'd said, "You didn't look like a woman who needed rescuing." The way he'd meant it as a compliment rather than a dismissal. She went inside and cooked her supper and told herself firmly that she had more pressing things to think about. 3 days later, Clyde Crawford rode through her gate. He was on a gray horse this time, a long-legged animal that moved with the liquid ease of a horse that has covered a great deal of ground. He was not wearing the duster today. It was warm, the kind of early April afternoon that already felt like summer's intention, and without it, he looked both more ordinary and more directly himself, a lean man in a plain work shirt and well-worn trousers who rode like he had been born doing it. Myrtle was in the yard mending a section of fence that had come loose over the winter. She had her sleeves rolled up and dirt on her hands, and she was not, by any standard measure, at her best. She straightened when she heard the horse and watched him ride up with the cautious attention she gave to anything unfamiliar approaching her land these days. He raised a hand in greeting from a distance, which she appreciated. It was the gesture of a man who understood that approaching a woman's property without announcement was an imposition, and that you ought to identify yourself clearly and give her the chance to decide whether you were welcome before you got too close to make that choice meaningful. "Miss Whitfield," he said, when he'd pulled up to a respectful distance. "I was up this way checking on some strayed, rambling fork cattle. Thought I'd see how you were getting on." She studied him. She had spent 3 days telling herself she'd read too much into a 5-minute conversation outside a land office, and now he was here, and she found that her assessment of him had not changed. He had the face of a man who said what he meant, and what he meant was usually something considered rather than impulsive. "I'm getting on," she said. "Come down if you like." He dismounted and tied the gray to the fence post and came over to where she was working. He looked at the fence, assessed it with the automatic professional eye of anyone who has spent time on a working ranch, and said, "That post needs resetting before the new wire will hold." "I know," she said. "I was going to do it tomorrow." "I could do it now," he said. And then, with that same directness that had startled her in town, "I'd feel better being useful. I'll be honest with you, I came up here partly to check on you, and I don't know how to do that without something to do with my hands." She looked at him for a moment and then she laughed, just a small, surprised laugh that she hadn't seen coming, and it felt strange and good in her chest the way the first warm day does after a long cold stretch. "The post-hole digger is in the barn," she said. He went and got it. They worked together for the better part of an hour, Myrtle holding the wire taut while Clyde dug out the old post and reset it in fresh-stamped earth. And they talked while they worked in the comfortable, unforced way of two people who are not trying to impress each other, but are simply sharing the same task and finding it agreeable. He told her about the Rambling Fork Ranch. He was one of 3 senior hands, had been there 4 years, come up from the lower Rio Grande country where he'd spent his 20s working cattle drives north along the Kisham Trail. He was 31 years old, he said, when she asked, and he had been in Dalton Creek County long enough to know most of the ranching families, but not so long that he'd stopped noticing things that the settled people had learned to overlook. She told him about the land, about her father, about the business of the homestead claim. She did not tell him about Sela's Greer yet. She was not ready to tell anyone about that yet. It felt too close to the bone, too adjacent to the specific kind of helplessness she did not want to advertise. But she told him about the oaks and why her father had kept them. And Clyde listened to that the way she had always hoped someone might, with his full attention on her face, not waiting for a break in the conversation to say something of his own but actually taking in what she was saying. And when she finished, he looked out at the line of oaks along the creek and said, "He was right. That's good ground under those trees. The water will stay if the roots stay." It was exactly what her father would have said. By the time the post was set and the wire strung and tested, the light was going amber and long, and Myrtle said, "You'll want to get back before dark." "I will," he agreed. He stood there a moment, looking at her with that steady, honest attention. The bruise was fading by now. It had shifted from that deep storm purple into the yellow-green stage that looked, in certain lights, almost like a badly mixed paint sample. And she was aware of it in the way she always was when someone was looking at her directly, a background hum of self-consciousness that she hadn't quite managed to fully suppress. "That's fading," he said, which was not a question and not an accusation and not pity. It was just an observation stated plainly, the way you'd note that the weather was clearing. "For days we'll do that," she said. "Is whoever did it going to come back?" he asked, quiet, even, like asking if she expected rain. She looked at him steadily. "Maybe." "All right," he said, just that. No performance of outrage, no declaration of what he'd do about it, no attempt to take the problem out of her hands. Just an acknowledgement that he'd heard her and was filing the information accordingly. He mounted his horse and rode out through the gate, and Myrtle watched him go and did not tell herself this time that she had more pressing things to think about. He came back 4 days after that. He brought back a calf that had strayed onto the Whitfield land from the rambling Fork herd, a legitimate errand, and stayed for coffee after they'd sorted the animal out. He sat at her kitchen table and drank coffee that she'd made from the good beans she saved for important occasions, and she was not quite sure when she decided this qualified, but she had. They talked for 2 hours. About the land, about cattle, about the particular injustice of the drought that had hit 3 years back and stripped the smaller operations to their bones, while the big ranches with water rights to the creek survived intact. Clyde had a way of talking about injustice that she found bracing rather than deflating. He named it plainly and with appropriate anger but without despair, the way you discuss a hazard in the road rather than a fact of nature that cannot be changed. He asked her about her plans for the spring planting. She asked him about the rambling Fork operation and what it was like working land that wasn't yours. He looked at that question thoughtfully before he answered, which was something she was coming to recognize as characteristic of him. He did not give the first answer that came to him but the right one. "It's good work," he said. "I respect Hank Ramble and the ranch is run fair. But it's not the same as having your own ground. There's something about working your own land, knowing that what you put into it comes back to you, that I think about. My father used to say that owning land was the only kind of freedom that was actually reliable," Myrtle said. "Your father sounds like he was a man worth knowing," Clyde said. "He was," she said, and the 2 words had some grief in them that she no longer tried to hide. Clyde did not try to smooth it over. He just stayed in the moment with her, in the quiet that followed, and let it be what it was. On his way out at the door he said, "I'm going to come back next week if that's acceptable." She looked at him, and there was a question behind his question that they were both aware of, the kind of question that polite people ask obliquely when they are talking about something more significant than a social visit. "That's acceptable," she said. He smiled. It was the first time she had seen him fully smile, and it did what she had been slightly afraid it might do. It made him suddenly, almost inconveniently, beautiful in the uncomplicated way of a person whose face is at its most honest when they are happy. She stood in the doorway and watched him ride away until he was just a brown shape in the green-gold distance, and then she went back inside and permitted herself, carefully, to be something that felt tentatively, cautiously like hopeful. Sela's Greer came back on a Thursday. Myrtle saw the dust before she saw the horses, two riders coming down the north road at a pace that was not quite aggressive but was pointed, purposeful in a way that made her stomach tighten. She recognized Greer's big bay immediately, and the man beside him was one of the Kingsley hands she'd seen before, a thick-necked fellow named Dunmore who had the look of a man hired more for size than for cattle work. She was at the barn when they came through the gate, and she walked out to meet them in the yard because she had decided, after that first incident, that she was not going to let herself be caught in a position of disadvantage if she could help it. She had her father's old shotgun. She was not going to use it, probably, but she held it the way her father had taught her, broken over her arm, not threatening but not hidden, because there was a difference between being armed and being violent, and she had every right to the former. Greer pulled up and looked at the shotgun and then at her face, the last of the bruise still faintly visible, with an expression that was somewhere between contempt and something more complicated. "Miss Whitfield," he said. He was a big man, Greer, somewhere in his 50s, with a white mustache and the leathery look of decades of sun and wind. He would have been handsome once. Now he mostly looked like a man who was used to getting what he wanted. "I hear you went to the land office." "I filed my homestead claim," she said. "Yes. That land doesn't need to go through all that trouble," he said, with a kind of false reasonableness that she recognized from their previous conversations. "Mr. Kingsley is prepared to offer you a very fair price, more than fair, enough that you could go somewhere comfortable, somewhere a woman on her own would be safer." "I don't need to be safer," Myrtle said. "I need to be left alone." Greer's jaw tightened. "Miss Whitfield, you're making this harder than it needs to be." "I'm not making anything," she said. "I'm standing on my own land, which I have filed a legal claim to, and I am telling you that it is not for sale. Those are simple facts. You're welcome to leave now." Dunmore shifted his horse, not going anywhere but moving in that calculated way of large men who want you to be aware of their size. Myrtle kept her eyes on Greer because Dunmore was not the decision-maker here. "You should think about what you're refusing," Greer said, and the false reasonableness was gone now, replaced with something flatter and colder. "You're one woman. This is a lot of land for one woman to hold." "Plenty of women hold land in this state," she said, "and more of them will. The law says so." They stared at each other across the dusty yard. Myrtle was aware of her heartbeat, and she was aware of the shotgun on her arm, and she was aware of the specific quality of stillness that precedes violence, and she had to believe that Greer was not quite stupid enough to go further than he already had, not in broad daylight, not with a legal filing already sitting at the county land office with her name on it. He was not. He pulled his horse around with an irritated jerk and said, without looking at her, "You'll reconsider." "They all do." She waited until the dust from their departure had settled before she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and let her hands shake for 5 minutes, which was what she had promised herself, 5 minutes, and then she was going to do something practical. What she did, after the 5 minutes, was write a letter to the lawyer in Grover's Mill whose name Clyde had given her. Whitaker. She described the situation clearly and asked about her legal options regarding trespass and intimidation. She sealed the letter and addressed it, and then she sat there for a while longer, thinking. When Clyde arrived the following Tuesday, she told him about Greer. She told him all of it, the 3 years of pressure on her father, the incident 4 days before she'd gone to the land office, the visit yesterday with Dunmore in tow. She told it plainly and without embellishment, because she had decided that if she was going to trust this man, and she was finding, more than she had expected, that she was going to do it properly. He listened without interrupting, sitting across from her at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold in his hands, his face doing that thing she'd noticed before, the controlled fury, directed not at her but at the situation, at the men responsible, held carefully in check because he understood that what she needed was not his anger but his attention. When she finished, there was a silence that was not uncomfortable. Then he said, "You wrote to Whitaker." "Yesterday," she said. "Good." He set the coffee cup down. That's the right move. Whitaker's handled cases like this before. He knows how to build a paper trail that makes it very expensive for men like Greer to keep pushing. He paused. Did you tell Deputy Hobbs? She laughed, just slightly, without much humor. Hobbs was in the land office the day I filed. He didn't say a word either. Clyde looked at her steadily. I know, but you should report it anyway formally, even if Hobbs does nothing with it, because then there's a record, and if Greer does something again, that record matters. She nodded, recognizing the strategic logic of it. You've thought about this kind of thing before. I grew up watching it happen to smaller operations, he said. Big ranches pushing the little ones out. I've seen it done a dozen ways. The legal way is always the slow way, but it's the one that actually holds. He met her eyes. He hit you, Myrtle. It was the first time he'd used her name, and it landed differently than she expected, not as a presumption, but as something intimate and direct. The way you use a person's name when you want to be certain they know you're talking to them as themselves, not as a category. That's assault. That can be charged. Proving it, she said. I know, his voice was quiet. But write it down, date it, put it in your letter to Whitaker. That's what you can do right now. She looked at him across the table, this man she had known for 2 weeks, who had appeared outside a land office and said the right thing when everyone else had said nothing. And she thought about what her father used to say about people who showed you who they were in small moments before the big moments came. He had been very clear in those conversations that the small moments were the ones you should pay attention to. You're a good person, Clyde Crawford, she said. She said it simply, because it was simply true. He looked slightly startled, as though he had not been expecting it, and then something in his expression shifted. Something that had been careful and measured loosened slightly, like a fist unclenching, and he said, I'm trying to be. They were quiet for a moment, and in that quiet something passed between them that had not been there in quite that form before, a recognition of something growing in the space they'd been building together over these weeks of coffee and conversation and honest words. Myrtle looked down at her hands on the table and then back up at him, and she said, I think you should know that I'm not I have not had much practice at this. At what? He asked, though she suspected he knew. At having someone I can talk to, she said. At trusting someone. My father he was everything. And these last 6 weeks alone, she stopped, started again. I'm saying I don't know quite what this is yet, but I know it matters to me, and I didn't want to not say that. Clyde looked at her for a long, clear moment. Then he said, I rode out here on Tuesday because I was thinking about you all week, and I couldn't come up with a better reason than checking on a stray calf. He paused. I think you're one of the bravest people I have ever met. I think what I feel when I'm driving back to Rambling Fork after seeing you is that I don't want to be driving back. He said it quietly, without drama, the way he said most things, as a statement of honest fact rather than a performance. So I think I know what this is. They looked at each other across the kitchen table, in the afternoon light coming through the cotton curtains, and Myrtle felt something settle in her chest, something she hadn't realized had been off balance until this moment when it came right. All right, she said softly. Then we know. He smiled, that full, honest smile she'd seen once before, and she let herself smile back at him this time fully, without reservation. He did not kiss her that afternoon. He was not that kind of man, the kind who pushes past the natural pace of things because he can. He went back to Rambling Fork as evening came, and he went with something different in the quality of his departure, a lightness in it that had not been there before, and Myrtle watched him ride out through her gate and thought that there was something to be said for a man who could hold still in a moment instead of rushing it. She wrote a report to Deputy Hobbs the next morning. She made it formal and factual, dates, descriptions, the specific incident with the backhanded blow. She kept a copy for herself and sent one to Whitaker in Grover's Mill, along with the longer letter she had already written. She was building her paper trail, and she found the building of it satisfying in a way that was different from but not unlike the satisfaction of mending a fence properly, the specific pleasure of having done the right preparation, so that what was built would hold. Whitaker wrote back within the week. He was a practical man. His letter was plain and efficient, and he confirmed that her homestead claim, based on what she described, was legally sound, and that the intimidation by Greer constituted a civil matter at minimum and potentially a criminal one if she could establish a pattern. He was willing to represent her at his standard rate, which was fair for the county. He suggested she maintain thorough records and engage no confrontations with Greer directly. She wrote back that she agreed and retained him. Clyde came the following Tuesday and the Tuesday after that. And then, with the kind of natural drift that happens when two people stop counting visits because they have simply become part of each other's regular world, he started coming on Saturdays as well, arriving mid-morning and staying until the light went, and they worked on the things that needed doing. There was always something on a homestead that needed doing, and they talked through the work and through the meals, and through the long evenings on the porch where Myrtle had placed two chairs that had originally belonged to her parents, placed there years ago for the same purpose she was using them now. She told him about her childhood on this land, about learning to read by lamplight while her father went over the account books at the kitchen table, about the year she'd helped birth 12 calves in 2 weeks during a bad cold snap, and her father had said she had the best hands for it he'd ever seen. She told him about her mother, who had been a teacher before she married, and who had given Myrtle the conviction that knowing things was never wasted, even when the world was not particularly enthusiastic about women who knew things. He told her about his own upbringing in the hill country west of Austin, the second of 4 children on a limestone soil farm that had never quite had enough water. He told her about his father, a gentle, quiet man who had died when Clyde was 19, a horse accident, the kind of brutal random bad luck that the frontier delivered without sentiment, and how he had then spent his 20s moving, working cattle drives and seasonal ranch work, because staying still felt, for a long time after that, like something he didn't know how to do. And now, she asked, one evening on the porch. The last light was doing remarkable things with the live oaks, catching in the leaves and turning everything gold and green in equal measure. He looked at her with that steady, honest attention. Now I'm starting to think that staying still might be what I've been riding toward all along, he said. I just needed the right place. She reached over and took his hand, which was warm and calloused and entirely steady in hers, and they sat there in the fading light listening to the creek and the evening birds, and Myrtle thought that this was a kind of happiness she had never quite managed to imagine for herself, because imagining required a template and she had not had one, just the abstract conviction that something like this might be possible someday, and the patience to wait for it without being certain it would come. The land office formally registered her homestead claim on the 14th of May, 1882. She received a notice from Felix Pott's office. He had clearly been unable to delay it further given the documentation, and she held the paper in both hands and read her own name on it twice. Myrtle Ann Whitfield, title holder, 160 acres, Dalton Creek County, Texas. She walked out to the creek and stood under the oaks and told her father. She knew he couldn't hear her in any material sense. She said it anyway, because some things need to be said aloud even when the only ears to hear them are the water and the trees. When Clyde came on Saturday, she showed him the notice. He read it and then looked up at her with that smile, the full one, and said, "Your father would be proud." And she believed him, and the combination of those two things, the paper with her name on it and the warmth in his voice, sat in her chest for the rest of the day like a small, steady fire. The trouble with Greer did not immediately resolve itself. He did not come back to the property in person, but Whitaker informed her by letter in late May that the Kingsley Ranch had made a formal inquiry with the county assessor, attempting to dispute the claim on the grounds of an alleged prior grazing agreement. Whitaker investigated and found no evidence of any such agreement, Because no such agreement had ever existed, Myrtle's father had never granted grazing rights to the Kingsley operation for anything more than a single season in 1876, under a verbal arrangement that had ended and was well documented as ended in his account ledgers, which Myrtle had preserved meticulously. She sent Whitaker the relevant ledger pages. He submitted them. The inquiry went nowhere. Greer's second approach was through Deputy Hobbs, who arrived one afternoon with the politely uncomfortable demeanor of a man sent to do someone else's dirty work, and aware that he is not coming off well in the process. He suggested that Myrtle might want to consider whether the land was worth the trouble, given the complexity of a single woman managing a full homestead claim. He phrased it as concern. It was not concern. Myrtle listened to him with perfect courtesy and then said, "Deputy, I have a letter from my attorney in Grover's Mill documenting an assault on my person by Silas Greer, which I reported to your office on the 20th of April, and which I have received no acknowledgement of. I would appreciate knowing the status of that report." Hobbs looked as though he had swallowed something unpleasant. "That is under review," he said. "Thank you," said Myrtle. "I look forward to hearing about its progress." She showed him to the gate with the cordial efficiency of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing. She told Clyde about it that Saturday, and he listened with his characteristic still fury and then said, "Whitaker should know Hobbs came by." "I've already written the letter," she said. He looked at her with something that was both amusement and deep admiration. "You always have." "My mother always said that a prepared woman is a free woman," Myrtle said. "I didn't know what she meant when I was young. I understand it very well now." In June, something changed between them that had been building for weeks, and that both of them had been, in their respective careful ways, moving toward without quite rushing. It was a Saturday evening, later than usual, the kind of night where the heat of the day had softened into something almost gentle, and the sky had gone deep blue in the west with a few early stars coming through. They had been on the porch for 2 hours, talking about nothing and everything, and at some point the conversation had simply stopped, not awkwardly but the way conversations stop, when what is between two people has grown larger than words and needs a different container. Clyde was looking at her, had been looking at her. She realized, with an intensity that he'd been keeping carefully banked for weeks now, the way you keep a fire back from a paper you don't want to burn, and she was looking at him. And the evening was very quiet and the oaks were very still, and she thought that there was absolutely no good reason to wait any longer. She leaned forward in her chair and so did he, and they met somewhere in the middle, and he kissed her with the same quality he brought to everything, deliberately, without hurry, fully present in the moment rather than rushing past it to whatever came next. She had been kissed before. Once, years ago, a brief and clumsy thing with a boy from the neighboring farm who had been more nervous than she was, and she had come away from it feeling mostly puzzled. This was something entirely different. This was the kiss of a man who had been thinking about it for a long time and had things to say that went beyond words and had found their form. When they separated, the night was a little warmer, or perhaps she was. He rested his forehead against hers, and she felt the slow, unsteady exhale of a man who had been holding something carefully for a long time and had just, finally, set it down. "I have been wanting to do that," he said very quietly, "for about 6 Tuesdays and all of the Saturdays." She laughed that full, easy laugh that had become natural around him in a way it wasn't natural around anyone else and said, "You might have mentioned it." "I didn't want to rush you," he said. "You had enough things happening." She pulled back just enough to look at his face in the blue evening light and she said, "Thank you for that." And she meant it for all of it, for the waiting, for the Tuesday visits, for the help with the fence post, for saying something outside the land office when nobody else would, for all of it. "Myrtle," he said, and her name in his mouth was still that particular thing, deliberate, personal, a word treated with care. "Yes," she said. "I'm in love with you," he said, plain as water. Just exactly that, true and that simple. She looked at him steadily in the growing dark. Her heart was doing something complicated, and she was aware of the oaks and the creek and the first full chorus of the night insects starting up and the specific warmth of the summer evening and his hands, which had taken both of hers at some point, and were holding them with a steadiness that seemed to be the physical expression of everything about him. "I know," she said softly. "I am in love with you too. I think I have been for a while, and I didn't quite know what to call it until just now." He smiled, and she smiled, and out beyond the porch the Texas summer night opened up enormous and full and theirs. He stayed later than he should have, they lost track talking, and it was well past 9 when he finally mounted the gray horse in the moonlit yard. He looked down at her from the saddle with an expression that she thought she could have studied for a very long time without getting tired of it. "Tuesday," he said. "Tuesday," she agreed. He rode out into the moonlight, and she went back up the porch steps and stood there until she couldn't hear his horse anymore, and then she went inside and felt the house, which had been quietly unbearable in its emptiness since February, feel something different. Not less quiet, but differently quiet, the kind of quiet that contains something rather than the kind that is just absence. July came in hot and serious, the way Texas July does, and the land needed tending with the particular urgency of a dry summer and the creek running low. Myrtle worked hard and worked well, and on Tuesdays and Saturdays Clyde was there, and on the other days she was building something from her own 2 hands and her own steady will, and the combination of those things felt, for the first time since her father died, like a life rather than just the managing of one. On the first Saturday of July, Clyde arrived with something different in his manner, not anxious exactly, but with the particular quality of a man who has been working up to something. He helped her with the morning's work without saying whatever the thing was, and she let him carry it in his own time because she had come to understand that this was how he worked. He didn't speak until he had the words right. After lunch, sitting at the kitchen table with the windows open to the not-quite breeze, he said, "I've been thinking about something." "I know," she said. "You've been thinking it all morning," he smiled. "Is it obvious?" "To me," she said. "Probably not to others." He looked at his hands on the table and then at her. "I have some money saved," he said. 4 years of good wages and not much to spend them on. And I've been doing some Hank Ramble mentioned to me that there's a section of land northeast of here, about 40 acres, that's going up for sale through the bank. A small operation, the man who had it defaulted on the note. The bank wants to move it fast. Myrtle was very still. 40 acres is not a lot, he continued, but it backs up to the Whitfield northern boundary. Combined, it would be 200 acres. And if I put my savings toward the purchase and spent the next year or 2 building something on it, he stopped, met her eyes. "I'm not asking you to make a decision right now. I'm not even asking you anything yet. I'm telling you what I'm thinking because I think you deserve to know what direction I'm looking." "Clyde," she said. "Yes. You're asking me something," she said. "It's just wrapped in a lot of land measurements." He held her gaze, and then that smile came, the full one, bright and a little helpless. "I suppose I am," he said. "I suppose what I'm asking is, does any part of what I'm describing feel like something you want?" She thought about it seriously, because he was serious and the question deserved it. She thought about her name on the land claim and her father in the Oaks and the long, hard solitude of 6 months, and the way Tuesday mornings had started feeling like the beginning of the week rather than just another day. She thought about his hands and the way he listened and the particular quality of being known by someone, actually known, not performed for, and how rare that was and how much it mattered. "Yes," she said. "All of it. Yes." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Then I'm going to buy that land," he said, "and I'm going to build something on it, and I'm going to ask you a proper question when I've done that." "You could ask the proper question now," she said, slightly amused. "I could," he agreed, "but I want to be able to give you something when I ask it, not just me and land, me and something that's mine to offer." She understood that. It was pride, but the good kind, not the kind that refuses help, but the kind that wants to show up whole. She squeezed his hand and said, "I'll wait." He bought the 40 acres in August. The bank was glad to move it and the price was fair. He signed the papers in Dalton Creek, and Myrtle happened to be in town that day for supplies, and she saw him coming out of the bank with the deed in his hand, looking like a man who has just claimed something that was always his. And she walked up to him on the boardwalk in full view of the Dalton Creek Main Street, and she kissed him on the cheek, and he stood there blinking at her with an expression of profound and delighted surprise that made her laugh. "What was that for?" he said. "For buying your land," she said, and walked on to the general store, and he watched her go with that full smile and a slow exhale. The summer moved on. The Greer situation had quieted, not because anything had been resolved, but because Whitaker's legal correspondence had made it clear that any further pressure on the Whitfield property would result in a formal civil suit that would cost the Kingsley operation considerably in legal fees and public attention. And practical men, which Greer was at his core, adjusted their tactics when tactics became expensive. He was not gone as a problem. He was merely dormant, and Myrtle knew the difference. Clyde spent his spare time through August and September working his 40 acres, clearing the overgrowth from the neglected previous operation, repairing fences, and beginning the framework of a structure that would eventually be a house. He had done construction work in his 20s, enough to know what he was doing, and the frame went up solid and square in the way that things built by people who know what they're doing tend to do. Myrtle rode over on several of the Saturdays they didn't spend at her place to see the progress. She stood in the half-framed house looking out through the open walls at the Texas horizon and thought about how strange and good it was that a person's life could turn so completely in the space of months, that she had walked into a land office with a bruise and a satchel full of documents in April, not knowing what was waiting for her outside. In September, a development arrived that she had not anticipated. She received a letter not from Whitaker but from the county, informing her that the disputed grazing claim Greer had submitted in May had not been fully withdrawn, but had been reassigned to a formal hearing before the county commissioners scheduled for October. This was a step up from the previous maneuvering. A formal hearing meant money, meant Kingsley's lawyers, meant a public record that could go either way. She wrote to Whitaker immediately. Whitaker responded quickly. He had anticipated something like this and had been preparing. He needed her original land patent, all correspondence with Greer, the ledger evidence regarding the 1876 grazing arrangement, and 2 witnesses who could testify to the history of the Whitfield property's independent operation. 2 witnesses. She thought about this. Her nearest neighbor, old Emmett Prout, had known her father for 20 years. He would testify. She asked him, and he agreed without hesitation, with the gruff simplicity of a man who did not like injustice but disliked fuss even more. He would come, he said. He would say what was true, because that was the only kind of testimony that made sense. The second witness was a more complicated question, and after a day of thinking about it, she asked Clyde. He said yes the same way Emmett Prout had, without hesitation, without drama, as though the answer was obvious and had been obvious before the question was finished. He had been present for enough of the situation to testify to the pattern of pressure Greer had maintained, and he had his own credibility in the county as a steady, reliable working man with no stake in the dispute beyond his honesty. She looked at him after he said yes and said, "You know this might put you on the wrong side of the Kingsley operation." He looked back at her steadily. "The Kingsley operation is on the wrong side of you," he said. "That tells me everything I need to know about whose side to be on." The hearing was in October, on a Wednesday, in the county commissioner's hall in Dalton Creek. Myrtle wore her good dress, the blue calico, the same one she'd worn to the land office in April, because she believed in continuity and in not running from the things that had already happened. Emmett Prout came in his Sunday suit that fit him somewhat better than it had a decade ago, given that he'd lost weight in recent years, and Clyde came in clean clothes and a quiet, steady presence that she felt beside her like a warm hand. Whitaker had come down from Grover's Mill the night before, and was a compact, precise man of about 50, with silver-rimmed spectacles, and the focused energy of someone who genuinely enjoyed getting things right. He had reviewed everything she'd brought him, and he was, she sensed, not worried. He had seen this kind of case before. He knew where the gaps in Greer's claimed evidence were. The hearing was 2 hours long. Kingsley's lawyer was a FT. Worth man named Carver, who was polished in a way that was supposed to imply superiority but mainly conveyed the effort of someone working hard to seem more confident than he was. Whitaker was not polished. He was clear. There is a significant difference. Myrtle gave her testimony. She did it the way she'd done everything since April, directly, calmly, with the specific authority of someone who knows exactly what they are talking about because they have lived it. She produced the ledger entries for 1876, showing the limited grazing agreement and its termination. She produced her father's correspondence. She answered every question that Carver posed with such uncomplicated accuracy that he had nowhere to go with the cross-examination. Emmett Prout testified with the immovable bluntness of a man who had watched 40 years of Texas and was not impressed by lawyers. He had known Horace Whitfield since 1863, he said. He had never heard of a permanent grazing agreement with the Kingsley operation. He had heard, on the other hand, of the Kingsley operation trying to buy Whitfield land and being refused, more times than he could count on one hand. Clyde testified. He was not a long-term neighbor and did not pretend to be. He testified to what he had personally witnessed: the visit from Greer in April, the condition of Myrtle when he'd seen her at the land office, the subsequent visit with Dunmore. He was factual, he was unshakable. He looked at the commissioners with those level Creekwater eyes and said what he had seen, and there was a quality in his testimony, the quality of a person for whom honesty is not a strategy but simply a way of being, that was worth more than any amount of polish. The commissioners deliberated for 20 minutes. The Kingsley grazing claim was denied in full. The Whitfield homestead title was upheld without qualification. Carver packed his papers with the tightly controlled expression of a man absorbing a bill he had not expected to receive. Greer, who had been sitting at the back of the room, stood and left without speaking. Outside the commissioner's hall, in the October sunlight that had finally dropped to a temperature that felt merciful rather than punishing, Myrtle stood with Whitaker and Emmett Prout and Clyde, and Whitaker shook her hand and said, "You had excellent documentation, Miss Whitfield. That is what won this hearing." "I had excellent preparation," she said, and looked at Clyde, and he smiled at her in that way, the full one. Emmett Prout shook her hand too and said, "Your father would have said something plain and true about today," and Myrtle felt the back of her eyes go warm for a moment. "He would have said that the law is only as good as the people who use it right," she said. "And then he would have gone home and fed the stock." Emmett laughed, which was a sound like a door on an old hinge, and clapped her on the shoulder and went to find his horse. Whitaker said his goodbyes and headed to the hotel for the night before his morning ride to Grover's Mill, and Myrtle and Clyde were standing on the boardwalk in the October light, and she turned to him and said simply, "Thank you. You did it," he said. "I just told the truth." "The truth matters," she said. "Having someone willing to tell it matters." He looked at her for a moment, and there was something in his expression that had been building since the hearing room, something that had been held back all morning while there was work to do but was now, with the work done, pushing forward with the patient insistence of water finding its level. He said, "I was going to wait until the house was finished." She looked at him, waiting. "The frame is up and the roof is on," he said, "but there's no floors and no glass in the windows yet, and I had a picture of what I wanted to be able to offer you when I asked. But I've been waiting for the right moment, and it occurs to me that." He stopped, looked slightly exasperated with himself in a way she found endearing. "I think maybe I keep finding reasons to wait because I'm afraid, and that's not a good enough reason." "Clyde," she said softly. "I want to marry you, Myrtle," he said, plain as water, just exactly that clear. "I want to build the rest of my life on this land next to yours. I want to be the person you tell things to and the person who tells you things, and I want to make a life here with you that's better than what either of us had in mind before we found the other one." He paused. "I don't have a ring." "I hadn't gotten to that part of the plan yet." She laughed, and her eyes were wet, and she did not mind. "I don't need a ring today," she said. "I'll need one eventually because I am still a woman with expectations, but not today." "Is that a yes?" he asked, and he was looking at her with everything hope and love and a kind of held breath waiting that she recognized because she felt it too. "Yes," she said. "Clyde Crawford, yes. Absolutely yes." He stepped forward and gathered her into his arms right there on the Dalton Creek boardwalk in the middle of the October afternoon, with whatever people happened to be passing. And she let him. And it was warm and solid and real. And she thought that the world was a considerably stranger and better place than she had given it credit for being on the morning she rode to the land office with a bruise on her face and the stubbornness to keep going. They were married in December, on a Friday, in Reverend Marsh's small clapboard church at the edge of Dalton Creek. The month had turned cold in the way that Texas December does sometimes, not brutal but real, a genuine winter chill in the air, and Myrtle wore her mother's dress, which she had found in the cedar chest in the back room 2 weeks earlier while looking for extra blankets, and had stood with for a long time before deciding, with a clarity that felt like both grief and joy in equal measure, that this was what it had been saved for. The dress was cream-colored, with small embroidered flowers along the collar, and it had been kept so carefully through the years that it needed only minor alteration to fit. Myrtle's neighbor, a woman named Dolores Aguilar who had a gift for sewing, made the adjustments in 3 evenings and charged nothing for the work, saying only that it was her pleasure, which Myrtle believed. Emmett Prout came to the wedding. He sat in the second row and wore his Sunday suit again and looked as though he was trying not to be visibly moved and failing. Dolores and her husband Francisco came, and 2 of the rambling fork hands who had become, over the months, genuinely fond of Clyde in the way that working men become fond of someone they respect. Whitaker had sent his congratulations by letter, which Myrtle thought was rather touching. Clyde stood at the front of the church in a new wool coat that she had not seen before and which she gathered from the precise way it fit him. He had gone to some trouble to acquire, and when she walked in on Emmett's arm, she had asked him, and he had been startled and then quietly, genuinely honored, and she saw Clyde's face when he saw her. She thought that this was the thing she had not known to hope for. Not the ceremony, not the dress. This specific face, this specific man, looking at her with everything he felt right there in his eyes, making no effort to hold it back. They said their vows to each other in the simple, serious way of people who have not taken the words lightly and are giving them their full weight. Reverend Marsh, who had known Myrtle since she was a child, looked as though he found the whole business deeply satisfying, which she appreciated. He said the words carefully and sincerely, and when he said, "You may now kiss your bride," Clyde did, and there was a brief, warm sound from the small congregation that felt like the entire room exhaling. After, they stood outside in the cold December air with the thin winter sun making the best of a clear sky, and Emmett shook Clyde's hand with the grip of a man who had decided to approve of him and wanted to make sure it registered. And Dolores embraced Myrtle and said something in rapid Spanish that Myrtle didn't catch all of but understood to be good, and Francisco clapped Clyde on the back. And the rambling fork hands were conspicuously cheerful in the way of men who have had a nip of something warming in the pew. Clyde had finished the house on his 40 acres in November, rushed the end of it, she knew, so that it would be ready for December, and that was where they went after the wedding, the 2 of them on horseback in the cold afternoon with the gray sky gone rosy at the edges, riding northeast to where his land met hers. The house was plain and solid, built from good lumber and laid on a stone foundation that would hold. The windows were glass, the floors were fitted plank, the fireplace was stone and drew well. It did not have anything unnecessary. It had everything essential. She walked through it on their first night and thought of how different the future looked now, not the solitary future she had been steeling herself to build alone, but this one, This warm, fire-lit version with his hat on the peg by the door and his boots under the chair and him standing at the stove saying he could make coffee if she didn't trust him with supper. "I trust you with supper," she said. "I want to see what you do with it." He made supper. It was simple and good. The way everything he did was simple and good, and they ate by the fire and talked. And outside the December wind was picking up and the Texas night was cold and enormous, and they were inside and warm and together. Spring came early in 1883, with the optimistic energy of a year that intended to be kinder than the previous one. Myrtle and Clyde worked their combined lands with the particular efficiency of two people who have found their rhythm together, dividing tasks not by role but by ability and inclination, which meant that sometimes she was fixing fences while he was doing the accounts, and sometimes it was reversed, and neither of them thought anything of it. The Greer situation resolved itself in March in the way that problems sometimes do, not through a final confrontation, but through a change in circumstances. Old Henry Kingsley, whose Operation Greer foreman, died in February at the age of 72, and the Kingsley ranch passed to his son, who was 23, newly married, and far more interested in building a sustainable cattle operation than in fighting over neighboring acreage through legal harassment. He sent a letter to Whitaker in March acknowledging that the grazing dispute was closed and that the Kingsley operation had no further interest in the Whitfield property. Myrtle read the letter twice and then set it in the tin box and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, feeling the release of something she had been carrying for almost a year. It was not a loud relief. It was the quiet kind, the kind where something heavy has been set down so gradually in so many small increments that you only realize how heavy it was when it is finally completely gone. She told Clyde that evening. He read the letter, set it down, and said, "It's over." "It's over," she said. He pulled her close, right there in the kitchen, and held on, and she held on too, and outside the spring evening was full of the sounds of the land waking up again. The creek running high and musical with the snowmelt from the hills, the birds loud in the oaks, the whole enormous Texas world going on with its business of renewal and continuation. Their first child was born in November of 1883, in the new house, delivered by the county midwife Mrs. Holloway, who had delivered half the county, and had the serene competence of someone for whom even the complicated versions of this particular miracle were simply a hard day's work. He was a boy, sturdy and dark-haired, and immediately, at the first second of his life, definitively himself in the way that certain people are. They named him Horace Clyde Crawford, Horace for her father and Clyde for his, and the combination felt right in the way that things feel right when they are arrived at honestly. Clyde held his son for the first time with the careful, slightly stunned expression of a man encountering something that has exceeded his capacity to prepare for it. He looked from the baby to Myrtle and said, in a voice that was not quite steady, "He has your nose." "He has your stubbornness, I suspect," Myrtle said. She was tired in the specific, profound way of someone who has done a hard and extraordinary thing and come out the other side of it, and she felt extraordinarily, quietly happy. "He'll need it on this land," Clyde said, and looked back down at the boy. And the love on his face was so plain and present that she had to look away for a moment, not because it was too much, but because she needed a second to contain it. The years that followed built themselves the way good years do, not without difficulty or hardship, because this was Texas in the 1880s and difficulty and hardship were simply part of the materials, but with the resilience of something rooted. The combined Whitfield-Crawford lands, 200 acres of creek-watered Texas range, grew into a proper operation. A small cattle herd, a kitchen garden, and eventually a few horses that Clyde had a particular gift for working with, which generated a secondary income in remuda work for the larger drives. Dalton Creek changed around them in the ways that frontier towns change. A second church, a schoolhouse that Myrtle fought 3 years to get funded and was eventually named a founding committee member of, a proper doctor replacing old Aldous Greer who was getting forgetful, a stretch of rail line that put the town in contact with Ft. Worth in a way that changed the economy of the whole county. Myrtle watched it all with the attentive engagement of someone who understood that the shape of the community was not fixed but actively made, by the people in it, through the choices they made about what they would and would not accept. She wrote letters to the county commissioners, about the school funding, about the road conditions, about a water rights dispute that was affecting 3 small operations in the Northwest Quarter. Clyde read the letters before she sent them and offered suggestions and occasionally said, "That paragraph is going to make Beaumont angry," and she would say, "Good," and he would smile. Their second child, born in 1886, was a girl. They named her Clara, for Myrtle's mother. She came into the world with an opinion about everything, expressed at considerable volume from the first hour, and she was her mother's daughter in every discernible particular. The dark eyes, the lift of the chin, the absolute refusal to be talked out of something she believed in. Little Horace, by then 2.5, regarded his sister with the resigned acceptance of a firstborn, encountering a development he hadn't been consulted on, and had decided to make his peace with. He was his father's son, steady, quiet, with those same creek-water eyes and the same quality of stillness that meant something when it broke. Clyde stood with Myrtle on the porch one evening in the fall of 1886, Horace asleep inside, baby Clara in Myrtle's arms working on the focused, important business of a very small person examining the face above her. And the oaks were doing their autumn thing, the leaves going gold and rust in the way that still made Myrtle's breath catch a little even after all these years on this land, and Clyde said, "Are you happy?" She looked at him over the top of Clara's head, this man she had built everything with, who had told the truth when nobody else would, and had shown up at her gate with a post-hole digger, and had testified at a county hearing and built a house on 40 acres, and held their son in shaking hands and read her letters to the commissioners, and still, 6 years after a morning outside a land office, looked at her with everything in his face that she needed to see there. "I am," she said, "completely." He put his arm around her, careful of the baby, and she leaned into his shoulder, and the evening light came through the oaks long and gold, and the creek ran below them in the quiet, steady way of water that has found its course and keeps it faithfully, season after season, year after year, through whatever the country sends. "My father used to say this was the best piece of land in the county," she said. "Your father was right," Clyde said. "He usually was," she said, and smiled. And in the living warmth of the evening, her children and her husband and her name on the land and all the long roads that had led here, she felt the deep, uncomplicated rightness of a life that had been honestly made. A year later, in 1887, the schoolhouse held its first full term with a proper school teacher, a young woman named Miss Eliza Farrow from Houston who had the courage and the capability that the job required. And on the first morning Myrtle walked little Horace through the door and settled him in a seat near the window. She stood outside the schoolhouse for a moment in the September air and thought about her mother, who had been a teacher, and about the letter writing and the commissioners, and the years of pushing, and the fact that this building existed in part because she had made it a fight she refused to drop. Clyde was waiting for her by the horses when she came back out. He looked at her face and said, "Good. Very good," she said. He handed her the reins of her horse. Juniper was gone by now, a gentle loss in 1885. This was a new mare, a dun she'd named Patience for reasons that had amused him, and they rode home together through the September morning with the sky enormous and blue above them, and the land on either side of the road known and familiar and alive with everything they had made it. The winter of 1887 brought a cold hard enough to freeze the shallow end of the creek, something that happened perhaps once a decade, and Myrtle and Clyde worked the land through it with the efficient determination of people who have weathered enough to know that the other side exists and is reachable. The cattle came through sound, the house held warmth, And young Horace developed a passionate interest in the creek ice that required fairly constant supervision, and generated several spectacular stories that would be told at Christmas tables for years afterward. By the spring of 1888, the Whitfield Crawford operation was known in the county as a well-run, fair-dealing homestead that had survived the Kingsley pressure and come out the other side of it. People came to Myrtle for advice about homestead filings. She gave it without hesitation. She told them about the Homestead Act, about documentation, about Whitaker's office in Grover's Mill, about the importance of building a paper trail before you needed it. She told a young widow named Rosa Esperanza, who had come to her on a Tuesday in April asking the same questions Myrtle had been asking in her own head 6 years ago, that the law was there and that it could be used, but that you had to show up for it and not let it intimidate you into silence. Rosa filed her claim the following week. Myrtle went to town with her and sat in the land office different clerk now, Felix Potts having retired to his sister's place in Waco, and watched the new man process the filing efficiently and without incident. Times were changing, not fast enough, but they were changing. Walking out of the land office afterward, Rosa said, "You weren't afraid." "I was terrified," Myrtle said honestly, "but I had done my preparation and I had the law on my side and I decided that was going to have to be enough." She paused on the boardwalk looking down the Dalton Creek Main Street that she had known all her life. "And someone told me I looked like a woman who needed the road cleared rather than rescued. That helped more than he knew." Rosa smiled. "Your husband." "He was," Myrtle said. "He didn't know it yet." She walked down the street in the April sunshine, thinking about that morning 6 years ago. The bruise, the silent room, the documents laid flat on the counter, and a tall man leaning against a hitching post with controlled anger in his eyes and words already forming that he was determined to say regardless of whether anyone in that town was interested in hearing them. He had said everything outside, when everyone inside had said nothing. And the everything he had said had been the start of all of this. The land, the house, the children, the school, the life built on honest ground by honest work by two people who had chosen each other in full knowledge of what they were choosing. She rode home to the land that bore her name and his, passing the oaks her father had kept, and the creek running clean and full in the spring, past the fence lines that had been properly set and held, past the corner where her ground met his ground, which was now their ground, all of it together 200 acres of Texas that they had defended and built and planted themselves into. And she came through the gate, and Clyde was in the yard with Horace on his shoulders. The boy balanced there with the reckless confidence of a 5-year-old on familiar terrain, laughing at something, and Clyde looked up when he heard her horse, and the laugh was still on his face when his eyes found hers, and she thought, as she had thought many times and would think many times more, that she had walked into a land office in April 1882 with a bruise and a satchel full of documents, and come out with everything worth having. Baby Clara toddled out from behind Clyde's legs when she heard the horse, saying, "Mama, Mama," with the urgency of someone who has been waiting for exactly this and could not wait one more minute. And Myrtle dismounted and scooped her daughter up and swung her and made her squeal with delight. And Horace shouted from his perch on his father's shoulders that it was not fair and he wanted to be swung too, and Clyde was laughing at all of it. And the spring afternoon was enormous and golden and full. She set Clara down on her feet and walked over to Clyde and put her hand in his, and he folded his fingers around hers in that steady, familiar way that still felt every time like something she had been given and never quite gotten used to. And they stood together in the yard of the life they had built, with their children tumbling around them and the oaks along the creek going full and green, and the Texas sky above them wide and blue and endlessly ongoing. And Myrtle Whitfield Crawford thought that this was what freedom actually looked like. Not the absence of trouble, not the end of difficulty, but the ground under your feet that had your name on it and the person beside you who had seen you whole from the beginning and stayed. It was spring in Texas, and the land was hers, and the man was hers, and she was his. And all of it, every document filed, every argument made, every mile ridden, every morning that had come after the hard ones had been worth exactly this moment and every moment still to come. She lifted her face to the sun. Beside her, Clyde's hand was warm and steady in hers. The creek talked quietly over its stones below the oaks. The children were loud and alive in the yard, and the day opened ahead of them, wide and golden, with no end to it that she could see.